Welcome to the Sarcophagus V2 Development Community Update. Today, the builders are going to be talking over the recent developments and design decisions on the V2 Sarcophagus Build. Afterwards, we will follow up with technical talk Q&A hosted by Quick Change, where they will be asking some questions about some changes regarding the Archaeologist design and how it will affect user experience and overall security. And then lastly, we'll open the floor for any questions from listeners and anyone here that might have for the builders and community leaders. So without further ado, let's talk about some recent updates with Sarcophagus.
I'm Seth. I'm on the technical side. I'm leading the team that's doing the development of the V2 ecosystem updates for Sarcophagus. So I guess I could give you all just a quick update of where things are at. We have taken on the contract updates of V2 as the first large milestone for the project, and we are nearing completion of the contracts. So a lot of the brand new features that are in V2 really revolve around Shamir secret sharing, and it will allow embalmers to select multiple archaeologists instead of a single archaeologist. So previously, a single archaeologist was a single point of failure. If a single archaeologist failed to do an unwrapping, then the sarcophagus itself would be bunk. But now the embalmer will be able to select multiple archaeologists. And so we've had a lot of fun designing that system out, the smart contracts. Right now, we're mainly writing a lot of tests around the smart contracts and making sure that we've really thought through all the different scenarios that can happen. But should be deployed to testnet, most likely within the next 2 weeks. There will not be really a way to interact with the contracts unless you want to interact with them directly. If you have the technical chops to do that, they will be available to do that. But the code is obviously up online now, but should be in close to final state. And we'll announce it to the community when those are up, just so anybody can take a look if they want to and give feedback. And then the Archaeologist, we are in the process of building that out right now. It's using libp2p, which is what IPFS is based on. So you'll be able to, as an archaeologist, spin up a archaeologist node very, very quickly. So V1, if anybody has done that process, they kind of know all the different hoops that have to be jumped through to get an archaeologist set up. In V2, it really should be simple as filling out your config file and making sure that you have the necessary tokens to participate in a sarcophagus as an archaeologist, which would be Arweave and the Sarco token, and then some ETH. So I guess those 3 tokens. So getting those tokens and then filling out a config file and then running the service should be pretty much a one-line command. That's really the goal here. And then we made progress on it. We can right now get nodes spun up in the internet, and they can find each other, discover each other, connect to each other. That's all working great. So the next steps here are really to get the nodes to talk to the contracts and start to do some of the fun, cool new things that archaeologists are going to do during the creating sarcophagus lifecycle. And we can talk about this more during the technical part of the talk near the end. So I'll just quickly move on to the web app. The web app is going to have a lot of awesome new updates. We're really focused on making it more user friendly and more not as necessarily crypto native. If people are crypto native, they'll have no problem using the web app, but we also want to make it easier access for people coming in who may not know that much about the system. They may know what it is, but maybe not how to use it that well. And we're really designing with that from that first principles in mind. So we're starting that process right now, kind of doing all the designs, figuring out what it's going to look like, as well as starting the development on some of the technical stuff that we can start doing now without needing the designs to be finished. So looking forward to the next couple months. We'll really looking forward to have some deployed online for y'all to look at and play with and get some early feedback before. There's no reason why we can't get the feedback cycle going pretty early in the process. We don't need to wait till like Q4 when we're launching the whole entire system to get feedback from y'all. So excited to share some things that come up. I'm always on Discord, so if anybody ever has any questions about the technical side, please come by Decent's Discord and say hi or drop a question in the Sarcophagus Discord. I'm in there rather frequently as well. And that's the end of what I got to say for now.
Awesome, thank you. A few other cool things to know recently with development and whatnot is there were 6 votes recently passed on the DAO. 2 of them were for provisioning the LP through the subDAO. That vote and all the info of it was posted up and passed. The V2 development, the Q2 funding, that vote was passed recently, and then a refund for the payroll subDAO to keep operations moving. So those were some recent votes and whatnot that were passed on the DAO. And the LP provisioning, something just to touch on a little bit, that was a new subDAO that was spun up recently and had a successful vote, and the USDC was moved. It was 500K in USDC and 500K in valued Sarco at the time, moved into a subDAO, and then the USDC was swapped for ETH, and then the ETH and Sarco in equal 500K value were placed in the LP. For the purpose of sustaining the economy, for keeping the dead man switch moving and allowing tokens to be freely available for people to use that. So that was what was going on with that. And then the ambassadors have also recently started doing some outreach and research for onboarding users and organizations to using the V2 tomb when it's ready. So reaching out to different organizations that are in the space and related to this area that could possibly use this tech, and discussing with them using it and just seeing how we can apply it in different areas. Also possibly discussing an open bounty through the ambassadors for looking at getting sorts of pledges and stuff like that for different uses that people are going to come in and use it once it's out. And then another good quick note related to that is the Rinkeby app right now. While Rinkeby is still available until sometime in August, the app is running really great. So if you want to test out the demo of the V1 version, you can get some tokens here in the Discord, and you can test that out. And then I believe they were talking about possibly just moving the repository over onto Goerli once the Rinkeby has shut down. So just kind of keep the demo going while they're building V2. And with that, quick change. I don't know if you've got your stuff prepared, but I think we're ready to start the technical discussion.
Okay. So hello everyone. This is the technical portion of the talk today. Typically we have these technical talks at least once a month, sometimes more. It depends on if a community member wants to push for that. This is not just hosted by me. Anyone can host these. We have some topics that can be covered. Usually they're voted on, and if there's something that you feel that you are you have some knowledge in, feel free to respond. Typically, I kind of open it up and ask if anyone wants to host it. I will help you kind of get everything in order. Usually, it is a presentation style, right? There's a presentation, and you kind of talk through. We've done a couple of them already. We've talked about the Archaeologist for V1 going into V2 and the possibilities of what could happen with V2, which we will actually talk about in more detail today. We've gone through what Sarcophagus kind of does, what is the idea of the project in general. We've talked about security of the Archaeologist, what you need to know to kind of make yourself as shrink that attack surface as much as possible. All right, those are things that are important to our users, because you could have a will on here or some type of information as a journalist that you don't want to you don't want someone to be able to get that information from you or from the Archaeologist in an easy way. You want to make that as hard as possible, because that information is important to you, and if it just were to be leaked out, that would be a problem. Now that is more of how you can help yourself for pretty much every reason. Sarcophagus doesn't have, for as far as I've seen with the code, I don't see an issue with that actually having the code. It's more of how you purchase your ETH and how you have your how you purchase your Sarco. If it points back to you as a user, that information is publicly available depending on if you are buying a website. Something we'll talk about later in this talk. But so aside from that, today we're going to get into this technical talk specifically about V2. I grabbed some pointed questions going through the GitHub, going through the discussion tabs of the GitHub, going through the actual portions of the GitHub that are public, whether they're in Discord. These are questions gathered all throughout the information that's available, and we wanted to have something that was a little bit more pointed, and to give all of you a better understanding of what is going on. So, Seth, I'm expecting that you'll be answering all these. I will also kind of lead into these questions. These answers, most of these answers have actually been posted in the Decent DAO in the Discord for the sarcophagus. Those questions were posted before this call even happened. I also post them in the general tab in our Discord in sarcophagus. So those questions were available. Those answers will be done now, and I'll kind of I'll help you out, Seth. I'll go through and kind of explain through everything, and then you can do the technical aspect of that. Is a little bit more Q&A style than a typical technical talk, but I think it's important to get that information to you guys in a more succinct and direct way. So we can begin now. So something that was discussed before was when dealing with the archaeologist, there's a portion that deals with Arweave, and that it's dealing with the permaweb. That information that you are locking away is stored permanently. Something that was discussed before was creating two separate archaeologists, one that deals with the encryption and the configuration of the archaeologist, and one that deals specifically with storing files on Arweave. That was something that was brought up before. And Seth, you answered this before. If you want to just give a little bit more detail, can you confirm whether the separate Arweave, will the archaeologist be separated into two portions, one for specifically Arweave and one for encrypting?
Yeah, we ended up deciding against doing this, and the main reasoning behind it is because of one, the complexity it adds to the system, and two, that complexity leads to more potential for failure of the sarcophagus being successfully created, which is really probably one of the biggest sticking points right now in V1 is the number of number of sarcophagus that fail to get created. I think recently it's been a lot better, that percentage. But splitting the archaeologist into two separate services creates two potential points of failure during that creation process. And so we decided to go with the simpler solution and just continue to have the archaeologist responsible for that. The caveat there is that now, because an embalmer can select multiple archaeologists for any given sarcophagus, one option is to have all the archaeologists you select responsible for uploading a piece of the payload to Arweave, a piece of whatever the main secret is that you're kind of hiding and going to be delivered to the recipient. But we have decided to, as of right now, currently only one archaeologist you select will be responsible for uploading that payload to Arweave. So in a sense, there will sort of still be this Arweave archaeologist. It's just that they would still be somebody that's also running the archaeologist software responsible for carrying out sarcophagus jobs. Mm-hmm. So hopefully that helps answer some of them.
That's a great point. So now so just to kind of explain for everyone, if you don't know, what happens is when you encrypt your file, when it gets encrypted by the archaeologist, it gets placed on the Arweave network, meaning it stays there forever. It is literally the permaweb, right? It's permanently there, and it's essentially an indexed pointer to where you can actually get your file. So in this case, the thought was, hey, can we actually separate who's putting it on Arweave and who's encrypting it? And because of the complexity it adds and the possibility of failure, it makes more sense to avoid that failure to actually just not separate that and have it in the same kind of the same way that it was set up before. With the caveat being that there are now multiple archaeologists. Do you know the reason for that failure rate?
So there's a couple reasons. The main reason that we had run into was actually failed transaction on Arweave. So Arweave was sort of finicky with the fee that you would pay. So sometimes the software we use automatically suggests a fee, so that the network has the auto-suggested fee. And you would think that suggested fee would work, and a lot of times it was coming in too low. So we put in a multiplier on the V1 where the archaeologist could choose to pay like a multiple of what the fee is to have a higher chance of it going through. But you could actually pay too much which is not usually the case with other chains we've seen. Usually you could just jack up the price as high as you want to get it through, but you could actually pay too much and it would fail to go through. So there was sort of this window you had to hit, and it was sort of a moving target. And so that was really a reason for a lot of these dropped sarcophagi in V1. However, as of recently, that's become much less of a problem. And I think it's mostly due to the fact that Arweave has really upgraded their software and done a lot of great things with their chain to improve consistency.
Okay, and then with the and this may not be ironed out yet, but when it comes to having an archaeologist, you said that you're leaning towards going with one archaeologist uploading the payload. If you choose, in this case, we'll get more into more details on this for understanding the Shamir secret share. Simplify it. Let's say you have 5 archaeologists, a pool of 5 archaeologists. Will 4 archaeologists, how does that work? Does only one person gets the payload and the other 4 just kind of is sitting back? Is it randomly chosen? Is it someone with like a best statistical approval rating? How is that actually working?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's sort of still TBD. What we've discussed is having an algorithm sort of figure out the best one to pick. So it would be 1 while the other 4 sit back if you're selecting 5. It's a question of how do we select that one? So right now what we're thinking about doing is having an algorithm that uses either statistical data from the chain to say like, hey, this archaeologist has a bunch of successes already. There's a high chance they're going to be able to upload it successfully, along with their fees. So if they have extremely high fees and not a lot of successes, we'd probably go with somebody with lower fees to upload, fee per byte, that is. But we will also give the embalmer the ability to override that quote unquote smart Arweave archaeologist selector. So it'll automatically suggest one, but then you could say, okay, you know what? I actually know this archaeologist. I've worked with them before. I'm going to select them instead.
Okay, that answers a lot of questions. So just before we continue, are there any questions on how that's going to work? Right, there's still as an embalmer, right? If you're not an archaeologist, essentially what you'll be able to do is you will be able to upload your file in a similar fashion. You will choose your archaeologist, which we'll get into later. So let's just say if it was V1, you have your file, it's encrypted, you send it to your archaeologist same way, and they will still upload the Arweave, but in this case, all things equal, you will actually be able to see, hey, it's going to pretty much prompt you as far as I'm understanding. Seth, you can correct me if I'm wrong or overstating anything. If you are selecting your Arweave archaeologist, when it selects one, it'll kind of prompt you, hey, is this one you want? You can say yes or no and select another one if you don't want that one.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, are there any questions so far? Okay, so we'll continue. And Seth, thank you for answering all these questions ahead of time. They will help to get this information out there and get everyone, kind of to see. We'll allow everyone to see what is going on with the next steps. So, from an embalmer standpoint, right? As an embalmer, we want this to be. The idea is to make this as simple as possible, but without taking away too many decisions. But we don't want you to be able to cause your information to disappear or fail. So one of the big questions was, what from an embalmer standpoint, what is going to change? So an example that we have is the user still uploads a file, right? They use the recipient's key to encrypt that file. But how will fees be chosen, and how will they select the archaeologists? There's mention of also how will fees affect the embalmer in general? How will those act throughout the life cycle of the sarcophagus?
Generally speaking, there's a number of places where fees occur. The main fee at the beginning of the process happens when you create a sarcophagus. There's 2 transactions in V1 that have to happen in order for a sarcophagus to be created, and that will be the same in V2. There will be two transactions that happen. So the embalmer will have to pay transaction fees on both of those phases of the sarcophagus creation, initialize and finalize, just as they do. Still be selecting a single archaeologist to pay the to do the upload to Arweave. So that will also be the same as V1. You'll pay pay a single storage fee. The one extra option there is we're going to give the option for the embalmer to pay multiples of the storage fee. And what that will give them the option is if for some reason the Arweave upload fails, then they would have the option to retry that Arweave upload. So in V1, if the Arweave upload fails, the sarcophagus is dead in the water. So at that point, the embalmer's already done the initialize transaction on the creation of the sarcophagus. And that means that they've lost out on that transaction fee. And so they lose money in that case, and we want to avoid that if possible. So in this case, if they want to pay a little extra, almost an insurance fund on the Arweave upload, they can pay a multiple. And if for some reason it fails, they'll be able to retry that Arweave upload without having to recreate the sarcophagus from scratch. So that's an extra little thing that's different with the fees. As far as the archaeologists go, since you are now selecting more archaeologists, this could potentially be a little more expensive in V2 than it is in V1, but it really depends on how the market ends up. Once we get a lot more archaeologists online, it may be that archaeologists may set their fees lower than in V1 because of hopefully the amount of activity we're expecting to have with V2. But there will be some experimentation to be done there as to how high the fees will go. Because if you select, say, 20 archaeologists, well, you're going to have to pay 20 archaeologists digging fees every time you rewrap, as well as the bounty for all of these archaeologists. Right now, it's a very simple algorithm. Like, it's very similar to V1, where the archaeologist gets to set their rewrapping fee and their unwrapping fee. And the rewrapping fee is the one that's paid every time that the embalmer attests that they're still alive. We could potentially look at some kind of other bonding curve for fees, or a different, more complex way to handle those. But as of right now, it's very linear and simple. So you would pay each archaeologist their digging fee every time that you rewrap, and you would pay them their bounty when they successfully unwrap at the end. And one other quick note there, I don't know if this is the time to get into that, but during an unwrapping, because we're using Shamir secret sharing, it means that, let's say you have 5 archaeologists, the embalmer will get to set how many of those archaeologists it takes to successfully unwrap in order for the sarcophagus to be resurrected, meaning the recipient gets to actually see the final payload that was supposed to be delivered to them because the embalmer, quote unquote, died and did not attest. So you get to set that as the embalmer, that number. So if, say, I've selected 5 archaeologists, I could say, hey, just one of these archaeologists has to do their job in order for this to be resurrected. Mm-hmm. So in this case, if a single archaeologist were to do an unwrapping and you've selected 5, well, at that point, the sarcophagus could still be resurrected, and the first archaeologist to unwrap will get paid their bounty. But because there's still 4 other archaeologists that could still unwrap, even though it's not necessary for them to unwrap for the resurrection to occur, we still want to make sure that they get paid if they do their job, even though it's not necessarily necessary. So they would still get paid their fees if they do the unwrapping in that case. And if for some reason only one does do the unwrapping and the other 4 don't, the embalmer has an option to claw back that money, that Sarco, if they want to, after the fact, even if the sarcophagus has been successfully unwrapped by the number of archaeologists they've selected as the minimum number. So they could still get some of their money back, even if everything goes successfully. And so other than that, it pretty much works the same way as in V1 with the rewrapping and the unwrapping. So hopefully that clears some of it up, but let me know if you have questions about that.
No, I think that's a good point. And then in the case of these fees, in V1, as is available in V2, the archaeologists get to decide their digging fees, and the archaeologists get to decide their bounty as well. So that's still going to carry over. That's still going to be the same thing. Just if you select multiple, you're going to pay. If you select, a large amount of archaeologists, you're paying a large amount of fees because one archaeologist is not going to be as much as 10 archaeologists, essentially.
Right.
Okay. So yeah, it's essentially, it's an additive to your selection. So for those who don't know, there is a digging fee, meaning there is always a digging fee. Digging fee typically is paid for the initial time you start a sarcophagus, and every time it is rewrapped, right? You're paying additionally for that archaeologist to take care of that tomb, make sure it's cleaned up, make sure it's extended, make sure everything's going on. So you're paying those digging fees. The bounty paid for when the sarcophagus is completed. So, okay, thank you for that. I will have this information. I know there's a lot here. We're going to have this information out. Again, Seth posted this in the Decent DAO. It's public. You can see that information. He's added a little bit more color to this because it's always easier to talk than to write it out, and we'll work on getting that information out to everyone after this is completed. We'll also eye everyone before it even goes out to make sure that all the information is correct. Okay. So question 3, this was answered by Seth. This is taken directly from the GitHub. So in V1, archaeologists kept their profile on chain, right? This for their profile, this means how much they need for digging fees, how much they need for bounty fees, how long is their resurrection time, right? The settings will shift to the sarcophagus, right? To the sarcophagi. They'll only be set during the sarcophagus creation, meaning that the archaeologists don't need to keep them on chain while everything else is going on, right? If your sarcophagus was created at a point and an archaeologist were to change settings, that's not going to affect your sarcophagus. Your sarcophagus is at the creation of your sarcophagus, at initiation of your sarcophagus. That's the information you have on it. Just going back, so originally those settings were on chain. These settings will no longer be on chain, right? These settings will shift to the individual sarcophagus, as stated. They're going to be set during the creation of the sarcophagus, and the archaeologist just has to sign off on the settings during the creation. That's it. That information, that is as is. Again, this information is out there. That's what it is. Everything stated is correct. So we can go on to the next question. And this was touched on a little bit just before. How are the archaeologists being paid throughout the digging fees and bounties in the case of unwrapping or rewrapping, because there are multiple archaeologists selected?
Yes, and this should be a quick, short answer. They will be being paid during rewraps and unwraps just like they are now. The only difference is that multiple archaeologists will be getting paid during that process. And I'm sorry, there's one big difference, which is that in V1, there is a transfer function in the contracts during the rewrapping and unwrapping that directly transfers Sarco to the archaeologists. As of right now, we've elected to, instead of transferring during the rewrapping and unwrapping, we are going to move that money to the contracts itself, to a storage mechanism, and the archaeologists can then claim that money at any time. So it will accrue there as they do jobs, and then at any given time they can run a transaction to get that Sarco back from them. And that was done mainly because of it's not an unbounded array, but there could be a lot of archaeologists on any given sarcophagus. And if we were to scale to like layer 2s or something like that, it could potentially be somewhat inexpensive to do like 40 to 50 of these archaeologists. And we could run into some problems based with the number of transactions in a block if we transfer this money during the rewrapping process. So instead of actually doing a transfer function, we will just be storing it on the contract, and then the archaeologist can then claim that money at any time. So they're still getting paid. They just have to actually run a transaction to transfer the money to their account.
Okay. So in the case of being paid, right, in the case of digging fees, right, because the archaeologists are, or I guess rather in the case of digging fees and bounties, right, it's all based, the amount of fees you're going to pay is based on what you as an embalmer are deciding you want your minimums to be, or what you're looking for. You don't want anything to be higher than that. I guess technically it's the embalmer's maximum and the archaeologist's minimum. The embalmer gets to choose how much they're willing to pay. And then what's going to happen is you're going to have the ability to select archaeologists that reach, that have payments that are allowed at that cost. So if you select, let's say 10 Sarco, any archaeologists that require more than 10 Sarco, they won't accept that. But if there are archaeologists that have 10 Sarco or less, you'll be able to select them. When you complete a digging fee, right, you're going to pay them the digging fee that they are requesting. And when you complete your bounty, you're going to be paying your bounty The difference with this is, like Seth said, there is now a smart contract for your there's now a smart contract related to your archaeologist in that sarcophagus. You can claim that at any point. It's not just going to be transferred every time there's a rewrap or unwrap, right? It's a little bit more of the archaeologist has to do a little bit of legwork to do this instead of just all this. It reduces the complexity that there could be with the amount of archaeologists there are. It's a little bit, it's more directed towards the archaeologist.
That's right, and so it'll be a little cheaper for the embalmer because they're not going to be. It's a little more expensive inside of a smart contract function to do a transfer, so the embalmer won't have to pay as much during rewrapping. And one other note here is one UX thing we're considering is, let's say you know your max budget as an embalmer, and you want to do, say, like 5 archaeologists for your sarcophagus. What we're thinking about doing is having the embalmer put in like a max fee that they want to pay for their entire sarcophagus. So let's say it's 100 Sarco. And then the embalmer web app would then automatically select 5 archaeologists based on their fees, their minimum fees that they've set, along with their reputation statistics, and try to get you the best 5 archaeologists for the job.
Yeah.
Just based on that single number.
I think that's a good idea because if, as a user, you don't know how long your embalmer is going to be, right? I guess really no. In both cases, right, there's still something to keep in mind. You don't know how long you're going to have that file on there. Could be, a couple weeks, could be a couple years, could be, decades, depending on when you use this. If you get to select, if you say, I want to pay 10 Sarco, but then you need to select 5 archaeologists, you're paying 50 Sarco. Is that what you intended? So I think allowing that maximum fee, or allowing, what you're willing to pay, decide that will make it a little bit more straightforward for a user, so that they're not, having that ability to do that will make it a little bit more straightforward to allow users not to be kind of blindsided when they get to the end and say, oh wait, I don't have enough Sarco for this.
Right. Yeah, we really want to avoid that. We figure people are coming in knowing at least a range of what they're expecting to pay there, and they can always play with that number too to see what that gets them. But we want to make that as simple as possible on the front end.
Thank you for that. So are there any questions? We're almost halfway through. Just have we'll go on to the next question. So a new function that has been added, has been discussed quite a lot, and something that people are always questioning. What happens if an archaeologist goes offline? What happens if you don't want to be an archaeologist anymore, but you still have some sarcophagi that you're in charge of, right? In V1, as is the topic in V2, you'll be slashed. You will get you'll pay a fee. Your collateral essentially that you put up as an archaeologist will be burned. But in this case, right, something to make it a little bit easier is the ability to transfer. So transfers have been announced, and there's going to be a small conversation, technical aspect conversation between an old archaeologist and a new archaeologist. That archaeologist is going to have to transfer the shard they have in Shamir's secret share that they're going to have to pass on to that. They're going to pass on the rights and responsibilities to that new archaeologist. And there's essentially an NFT contract that may or may not be necessary depending on how this is implemented. But it does bring to light the protocols that are on the ERC chain, such as ERC 721 or 1155. How exactly is that going to work? Did I miss a point in that, or is it as simple as there's going to be that conversation, old archaeologist and new archaeologist kind of pass on that key, confirm that is the correct payload, and say, okay, wash our hands of it, and that's it?
There's the mechanism we still have to figure out is kind of how the archaeologists are going to find another archaeologist that wants to take the job. It's almost like there needs to be a marketplace for me to signal and say, hey, I would like to transfer this because I'm not going to be able to complete the job or for whatever reason. And another archaeologist to see that and say, oh, I want that one. Let me grab it. So we still need to figure that out. There's still some work being done there. But as far as the actual mechanism for transfer, that's all solved. There's a lot of technical stuff that happens in there. I'll just run through real fast. It's just one archaeologist will decrypt their encrypted shard and then send that unencrypted shard, which is really their secret, over to another archaeologist who will then encrypt it, upload it to Arweave, and then that new shard Arweave transaction ID will get uploaded on chain. And so when the resurrection time happens, the web app will know to use that new shard instead of the old shard. And so that's at a technical high level, like kind of how it's going to work, but it should be pretty automated behind the scenes. Like the archaeologists aren't going to have to do that much. It's just going to be like, hey, I agree to take this job on from you, and I'll pay you for it. And then the service will just automatically do all that stuff. The NFT part really goes into ownership of the sarcophagus. And this is something we're still working on and discussing. Mainly, we're concerned about fees. We don't want to add too many fees into the sarcophagus creation process. And so these NFTs would have to be created for each shard. And so that's one shard per archaeologist. So let's say you selected 10 archaeologists, you'd have to be creating 10 NFTs for this sarcophagus. And each archaeologist would own one of those 10 NFTs. And when they do the transfer, they would also be transferring the NFT over to the new archaeologist. And there's some cool stuff you can do with the NFTs, which is why we like them. You know, it's really cool to just feel that ownership of the sarcophagus. It'll show up in your wallet. We could potentially show some metadata about the fees that have been collected so far for that sarcophagus. There's some other cool stuff we can do that really brings an ownership quality to the archaeologists that ties them to that sarcophagus. But we have to weigh that against how much it's going to cost to create those NFTs. And we are leaning towards trying to make it opt-in for the archaeologists. So if they want to create the NFTs, they can. And if they don't want to create them, then they don't. And then we can kind of see, hey, do these archaeologists even want the NFTs? And we'll kind of let us know and let the market give us some feedback about that. It gives a good general overview.
Yeah, I think that, one of the qualms about ETH just in general is, right, what if the fees go up? What if there's a new token that comes out and the gas spikes? How complex is this contract? How much gas is going to be required? Or how high is the max GUI that you're going to have to worry about what's going on with these transactions? So I think that's an important part to allow users to decide that the cost of fees is more important to me than the NFT, or the NFT is more important than the fees. That making that decision will allow that to make it a much easier process, or much more user-friendly in that case, to decide those fees. So something that's a little bit more, this is, I would say, probably the most complex question we have, just because of how in-depth you need to know the archaeologist. But in V1, when you create an archaeologist, the way that the conversation happened, or the way that you showed that you were live, right, alive as an archaeologist, is you needed a connection. That connection would be through a web server or an HTTPS connection. If you were live, right, then you could actually work through accepting a sarcophagus if someone wanted to create a sarcophagus, they would be able to select you because you were live, right? So going into this question, in V1, an embalmer needs to choose an arch that has an HTTPS connection, right? You need to have that connection on your side. An archaeologist could go offline, and a user wouldn't know until their sarcophagus failed and wasted their gas, right? So one problem we saw was that archaeologists, this was cleaned up in V1 for the most part, but it could still happen. It could still, depending on how the archaeologist went offline. If you went offline, you could still be there as an archaeologist. You could potentially be grayed out, but you would still appear in the list. Someone could technically still choose that archaeologist, and when they try to upload, that upload would fail. Their whole process would fail. They'd be wasting gas. So this new possibility to show that you're live is to upload your XPub. And we won't go into too much details on XPub, but XPub is pretty much the addresses that are generated from your private key. They don't show what you're sending. It's just an address where you can send to, right? You can see what has been sent to these addresses. And based off of the archaeologist, they could potentially upload their XPub to allow an embalmer to pull down an XPub to be ready to set up their sarcophagus. If that archaeologist wasn't live, you wouldn't be able to grab an XPub, so you wouldn't be able to go through that process of setting up the sarcophagus and then failing and paying the gas. With that being said, can you go into a little bit more detail? And at any time, feel free to ask a question. This is definitely one of the more complex situations where if you didn't know how to set up an archaeologist, or if you never set one up, dealing with that, or an embalmer, you could potentially, this may go over your head. That's fine. Again, we're going to provide this information, but this is definitely one of the more complex questions that we have. So Seth, can you go into further details? I this is one that I had the notes right in front of me from what you wrote up. I appreciate that. But just to kind of, I guess, simplify it and talk it through, V1 versus V2. Why is that the decision to do that?
So it's actually maybe a little different than what was described. So there will no longer be an HTTPS server. In V1, you had to set up your own domain. So you had to have archaeologist.mydomain.com and set up a Nginx reverse proxy or some kind of reverse proxy to a server. There's a bunch of stuff that you had to do. None of that is going to be necessary in V2. Since we're using this libp2p system, all you have to do is have an IP address running a server, and so you just would input what your IP address is, and it's just gonna use something called WebRTC to communicate with the embalmer in the browser, and it's just going to use TCP to communicate with other archaeologists during a transfer. So it can use these nice technologies we already have to send data and communicate in an encrypted way with each other. So that's a big difference between V2 and V1, just the communication channel between the embalmer and the archaeologist. As far as being online and offline, because the archaeologists have to sign off on the fees in V2, that means that they do have to be online in order to generate those signatures. So during the initial startup, when you go and visit web app and you're like, hey, where's all the archaeologists at? It will actually join the network as a node, the embalmer will, and will discover all the archaeologists on the node using sort of like a crawling algorithm. And it'll show you all the archaeologists that are actually live on the network. And it's not going to show you any that it can't find on the network. And if any were to drop off while you're during a session, it will also display that on the front end. So we will clean that up in V2. And that's really something that can also be cleaned up in V1. There's nothing technological about why we couldn't hide that archaeologist from the front end if they're not available. The other final thing to talk about here is what you were talking about, the XPub. So in V2, I guess in V1, the private key is what is published by the archaeologist when they're doing their unwrapping. So when they're actually doing their job, they're saying, here's a private key for the sarcophagus. And because they would have a different private key for every single sarcophagus, because they can't use the same private key, because otherwise, as long as I know one private key, then I could just unlock all your sarcophagi. So we had to do a different public key, private key for each sarcophagi. In V2, that's not going to be necessary. We can use the same public key for every single sarcophagi that an archaeologist takes on. So that means if you know that archaeologist's public key, even if they're not online, you could potentially create the sarcophagus. It just can't be finalized until the archaeologist signs off on the initialization that you've done. So the reason why we can do that is because the archaeologist is going to be actually publishing the unencrypted shard. So they're using their private key to unencrypt something. I guess decrypt is the word. Decrypt it and publish that decrypted shard to the chain. So they're never revealing their private key. And since they're never revealing their private key, well, we don't have to worry about generating a new one for each sarcophagus. And so that really actually simplifies the system a lot, because the contracts in V1 had to keep track of which index each archaeologist's public key was at. They had to keep track of that locally. And if they ever desynced, that would mean when the archaeologist went to unwrap, it would fail. So the big point of failure, that's not going to exist in V2. And the whole unencrypted shard functionality is, not super simple to understand. I recommend looking at the system specifications to kind of, specifically the diagrams that have nice, pretty pictures, because those are a little easier to grok than all the words. And it kind of shows how that whole system works, but it's pretty elegant, and I think it's going to work really well.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very in depth, and one of the, I reached out to you. I harassed you many times, Seth, when creating an archaeologist in general. I had a problem with the setup with the proxy and with the HTTPS server, setting up web server. That can be simplified, right? That's only a few steps. So once you go a little bit deeper and going through a little bit more technical setup, that's where you can run into problems. And I think from people, once I set up the archaeologist, I put out some videos, and people would reach out to me all the time asking about the servers and not realizing that you need to have a domain, you need to have an actual, if you're not going to set up locally, you have a VPS. And once, kind of went through that, of course, $5 is not bad for, I think DigitalOcean actually offers an even lesser one now. I don't know if the specs will actually work for it, but people will see that you need to pay for a domain, you need to pay for VPS. If they don't know how to set it up, it's kind of like almost like a barrier. But once they know that it's easier, once the video was out, definitely more people were setting them up, but they would get stuck a little bit at the web server. So I kind of had to walk them through it. I think I'm definitely a proponent of moving from the HTTPS connection for sure. P2P, that's another question that's coming up. I'll just knock that out. Just in general, the network updates from HTTPS to libp2p is confirmed for V2. There's gonna be some demos that allow you to connect your archaeologist. We'll look at this and test. Again, I will be looking to pull that information out to allow others to understand what's actually going on with that. We don't have to go into detail for that. Another quick question is, there was discussion of possibly having some type of bridge with Sarco, not necessarily using Sarco as a payment token. If you wanted to use ETH, which is not the native token for a sarcophagus, is that possible? And that adds a lot of complexity to this process. So as of right now, there's no plan to remove Sarco as a payment token. The next question, how will slashing be handled?
Yeah, slashing will be almost exactly the same as in V1. So if you understand V1, then you'll understand how it works in V2. Basically, if an archaeologist is naughty and fails to do their job, their bond will be slashed. So the free bond, cursed bond mechanism that was in V1 exists in V2. So just so very quickly about how that works, when you accept a job as an archaeologist, say the bounty is 10 and the digging fees are 10, so that's a total of 20. You have to put up 20 Sarco of your own as an archaeologist for that sarcophagus, and that 20 Sarco will be bonded throughout the life cycle of that sarcophagus until you do your job, at which point you get it back. So that makes sure the archaeologist has skin in the game and gives them incentive to complete the job outside of also being paid 20 on top of getting their money back. So that money gets locked up, and if you fail to do your job of the unwrapping, then that money will get slashed. The other way that it can also get slashed is through an accusal. An accusal is a little bit different in V2 in that because in V1 there was only a single archaeologist, so I could say, "Hey, I got the secret for your single archaeologist. Here's the secret," and that single archaeologist would get slashed, and their first bond would get sent to the embalmer, and then whoever called the accusal function. In V2 now could be 10 archaeologists. And in order to successfully accuse, you would have to upload multiple of the secrets, however many secrets it takes to actually do the resurrection. So the embalmer sets that. So let's say they say 3 out of 10. If I want to accuse, that means I have to upload 3 secrets. I could, if all 10 archaeologists have leaked it, I could upload all 10. So whichever archaeologist you accuse, so if it's 3 out of 10 and I accuse 3, those 3 will have their bond slashed. And the other 7 that you did not prove were bad will get their bond back. But if you were to accuse all 10 successfully, then all 10 would have their bond slashed in the accusal process. And the accusal is just to say, hey, the archaeologist leaked their secret early, so could potentially, that means that the recipient could get the payload before they were supposed to get it, which is when the embalmer, quote unquote, dies.
So essentially, for those who aren't aware, Seth, explained it perfectly. There's kind of 2 mechanisms. You either fail to do what you're supposed to, meaning unwrap, or you're unwrapping too early, where people can accuse you saying, "Hey, you're bad. We know this. We proved it. We show that you're with your secret. This was leaked." Right? That's kind of what's going on here. There's 2 ways it happens when you're slashed. Your bond or collateral gets burned. Right? You won't get your money back, and it's actually deflationary to the network. Thank you, Seth. Okay, so 3 more questions. The first one, easy one. Will there be public tests? Yes, there will be public tests. And then if so, when will you look to have your public testing?
So there's 3 parts to this ecosystem. There's the contracts, the archaeologist nodes, and then the web app. Once all 3 are live, the entire system can be tested. We're targeting probably pretty late in Q4 to have the entire system up and running and everything working with each other without any bugs, or at least minimal bugs. But we would like to release each part of the system as it becomes available to the community in case they want to test it. So the contracts could be tested once we're done with that. The archaeologist nodes could be spun up and tested, working with the contracts. Once we're done with that, we could potentially have a CLI for the embalmer. So if we wanted to actually create sarcophagi, we could have just like a basic function that runs that doesn't use the web app, but just quickly create sarcophagi so that we can see the archaeologist working. So we'll probably do that as a second milestone, and then once the web app's done, then the entire community can go on as an embalmer and create stuff. So we'll be releasing these things at different points over the next few months, and looking for the entire system to be up in Q4.
Okay, and then will the web app be optimized for mobile?
We are planning on making some significant mobile upgrades, at least from the UX standpoint. So far, my experience has been using general mobile, like MetaMask or whatever wallet provider using, like Wallet Connect mobile. The experience hasn't been great, and we kind of have to use, the embalmer has to connect to some wallet in order to use the application. So we're going to make it mobile friendly. I can't say for sure that it's going to be a spectacular mobile experience since we're relying on these wallets to work correctly on mobile. But we're optimistic that it will end up being a pretty good mobile experience.
On the tail of that, because public testing is Q, even though it could start earlier, Q4 is kind of still the target. If there's any delays, then soon after, once everything is kind of ironed out, all the any bugs or any pain points will be covered, then the V2 will be released soon after.
Yes,
okay.
Yeah, that is correct. And there's sort of there's some other things that we're doing in tandem with the Q4 release that will probably spill into Q1, such as looking at other layer 2s to release on, potentially other layer 1s. So those can happen once the system is up and running, since it's somewhat trivial to deploy these things on other networks. So there could be some other fun public stuff that will happen.
Thank you for that. One final question. There was mention of an SDK for, I know you're focused on the app on Sarcophagus, but something that has been brought up is, this should be easier for, a legal team to just have this in the background and be able to use this. Is that something that you're looking into doing now, or after? Are you looking to do the SDK after you are completed with the app, or are you doing it in tandem?
Probably it will most likely be after we get the whole system live for V2, but there may be some patterns that emerge when we start developing out the archaeologist service more completely and the web app. Say, okay, these are the functions that have to be there for an SDK to work, and we may try to abstract those into like an NPM package or something like that, or into an SDK to actually interact with these things. If we can figure out that we can save a lot of time doing it that way, then we'll actually start on it earlier. It's just not quite clear yet that would be the case.
Okay, so that is the end of the Q&A from my standpoint. This information will be posted. Are there any questions for anyone here?
Yeah, if anyone has any questions for Seth while he's here, now would be the time to throw them up. And thank you, Seth, for talking through everything, and Quick Change for preparing that.
Yeah, absolutely. If anybody's got anything, I'm happy to try to answer it. I know the system is dense, and I know some of you guys are pretty familiar with V1. We are we'll probably be looking for some feedback from the community as far as the web app is concerned. I think there's a lot of really good ideas and inventive ways we can make the web app better. So any pain points that you find using V1, we really would love to hear from you in Discord. Just like, hey, I don't like using this part of the web app in V1, or this part sucks, or I think it would be great if we did X for the web app. Just wanted to throw that out there. We're open to feedback there.
Awesome. And like they said earlier, there will be some more testing, and the V1 testnet tomb is available. I'll drop a link for that again in the generals. All right. Well, with that, it's been great having everyone here. Thanks for everyone for showing up.
Thanks, y'all.
You too, everybody.
Thanks,
Thanks
guys.
Awesome. Appreciate it, y'all.